The HCMS Yukon is a Mackenzie-class destroyer ship which was first commissioned for construction by the Royal Canadian Navy in 1957 and would enter service 5 years later in May of 1963. The Yukon measured 366 feet long and 42 feet wide with a draft of 13.5 feet, and aside from a collision with the U.S. aircraft carrier USS Kitty Hawk in January of 1983, which damaged its mast, the Yukon would reliably serve its intended purpose for the Canadian Armed Forces during its relatively uneventful service life over the course of the next 30 years, before it was decommissioned from service in December of 1993. With no further use for the Yukon, by the late 1990s, the ship was initially sold to the Artificial Reef Society of British Columbia in order to resell it to another potential buyer, and during the first few months of the year 2000, the Yukon was purchased by the San Diego Oceans Foundation for $250,000, and the Yukon was subsequently towed from British Columbia to San Diego soon thereafter. Upon its arrival in San Diego, the Yukon was thoroughly gutted and cleaned in preparation for its ultimate intended purposes, to serve as an artificial reef for marine life, and also to serve as an attraction for divers as well. Because of the latter, particular care was taken by the crews gutting the Yukon to remove potentially hazardous obstacles for divers, such as wiring and furniture installations, and other equipment within its interior to facilitate easy movement throughout the ship. If you've watched my video about the Andrea Doria shipwreck diving deaths that occurred in the summer of 1998, you're likely aware that, while obstacles within wreckages pose a very real danger to divers, perhaps the greatest hazard to these divers exploring shipwreck interiors is the prospect of becoming disoriented while doing so, and becoming entrapped within the ship's hull, unable to escape before running out of breathable air. However, since the Yukon had been purchased with the intent of allowing access to its interior to divers, extra measures had been taken by the salvage crews to make the interior accessible to divers to combat the aforementioned issue, as they would cut out multiple access holes in the Yukon's hull for divers, which also provided the benefit of potentially allowing light from the sun to leak into the interior of the ship as well. These holes in the hull were temporarily plugged with plywood during this process to keep the Yukon afloat while it was towed to its final resting place in Sunken Harbor, located near Mission Bay, to be scuttled on July 15, 2000, and as this date neared, excited divers from across the country would flock to San Diego seeking to explore the wreckage in the initial days following its sinking. The Yukon was towed to the scuttling site on July 13th after being rigged with explosive charges below the waterline to ensure that the ship sunk gently as intended and would come to rest on the seafloor 130 feet beneath the surface in an upright position, which meant that the highest point on the ship, the masthead, which was 70 feet tall, would only be submerged beneath 50 feet of water, and thus even beginner-level divers would be able to admire the wreckage up close and would be able to see the rest of the wreckage from the exterior clearly. Additionally, a majority of the rest of the ship would be resting above 100 feet in depth, which would allow access to a majority of the ship even for just recreational divers, with just a small fraction of the interior space requiring more technical diving skills and equipment to access. Truly a dive site that could be appreciated by divers of all skill levels. On the evening of July 14, 2000, the night before its highly anticipated scuttling, the usually calm waters of Sunken Harbor would begin to swell with waves, which in turn battered against the temporary plywood patches lined along the Yukon's exterior, and at just before midnight, water which had breached the hull and had flooded the interior of the ship began to cause the Yukon to sink. As a result, the the Yukon would not fill with water evenly as intended and would come to rest on the seabed on her port side instead of upright as they had planned. This unintended premature sinking of the Yukon would not only disrupt the festivities surrounding the scuttling, but would also pose several more pressing issues, as many of the intended diver access holes had been blocked off, which allowed silt from the seabed to leak into the interior. Furthermore, the exterior of the ship now sat much lower in the water than had been intended, which inherently made accessing the interior of the ship considerably more difficult and made navigating its interior significantly more challenging and disorienting for divers as well. Additionally, another issue that arose following the unintended sinking of the Yukon would pose a much more immediate threat as well, as the explosive charges rigged along the ship's interior had not been able to be detonated and still were contained within the hull, and thus diving at the site was prohibited in the days following, as U.S. Navy SEAL divers worked to remove the explosive charges, which would squander the hopes of many of the out-of-town divers that had traveled to San Diego to explore the Yukon immediately following its scuttling. Following the removal of the charges over the next 2 weeks, despite the disastrous sinking of the Yukon, access to the wreckage was now permitted to the public. However, while diver safety had been one of the primary objectives while preparing the ship to be scuttled, in an ironic twist of fate, nature itself had sullied their well-laid plans. The first deadly incident at the wreckage site would occur just a few months later, on the sunny morning of December 29, 2000, when a woman named Monica Vilka, accompanied by her husband and brother-in-law, would board a diving charter boat named the Blue Escape that would ferry them to the site of the Yukon's wreckage, located approximately 1.5 miles off the coast of Mission Beach. After the trio of divers prepped their gear, they would leap from the boat into the water, with Monica excitedly exclaiming, quote, "You guys have a good service," before the trio descended beneath the surface of the water and towards the wreckage of the Yukon. However, just after the trio had set off at 10:40 a.m., Monica's brother-in-law would encounter difficulties with securing one of his breathing gas tanks and would briefly resurface to resecure it and descended again at 10:45 a.m., rejoining Monica and her husband, and the trio would exchange okay hand signs after they reunited. Shortly thereafter, however, his tank would again become dislodged, and so this time, his brother would attempt to help him resecure it before they continued their descent. After the duo spent a brief time rectifying the issue, they would turn back towards where Monica had been waiting just moments before to discover that there was no trace of her to be seen. Monica's husband and brother-in-law would search the surrounding area for her over the course of the next 9 minutes before they abandoned their efforts and reported her missing to the Blue Escape's captain at 10:54 a.m., noting that they believed she had mistakenly continued to descend with another group of divers while they were in the process of fixing the issue with the tank. After no further trace of Monica had been found by 11 a.m., concern would begin to mount, as the Blue Escape would post lookouts with binoculars to scan the surrounding waters for any trace of Monica. Over the course of the following few minutes, a duo of highly experienced divers aboard the Blue Escape would concoct a search plan to look for Monica beneath the water, and would rapidly put this plan into action as they would descend beneath the surface to search for her at 11:07 a.m., at which time the Blue Escape's captain would also further contact the U.S. Coast Guard, who would arrive at the scene 13 minutes later at 11:20 a.m. 10 minutes later at 11:30 a.m., the first diver of the initial pair of volunteer search divers would return to the Blue Escape, having found no trace of her, and the second diver would subsequently resurface at 11:38 a.m., also reporting that he couldn't find any trace of Monica. The U.S. Coast Guard would launch their own search efforts at 11:45 a.m., which would continue for the next few hours. During this time, the search efforts were joined by San Diego lifeguards, who would finally locate Monica's lifeless body lying in the sand on the seafloor, approximately 30 feet from where the Blue Escape had been moored, as it had departed from the scene at just after 12 p.m. Notably, Monica's regulator was not in her mouth at the time of her body's discovery, and her equipment was subsequently sent in for testing to identify any failures. Her gas cylinders were found to still contain 2,600 psi of breathable gases, and her equipment was otherwise found to have been in good working condition, and so it was determined that she had likely spat out her regulator and subsequently failed to put it back in her mouth correctly and drowned. A not too uncommon phenomenon experienced mostly by inexperienced divers that panic after realizing they can't breathe, which then makes replacing the regulator correctly significantly more difficult to accomplish. However, while Monica Vilka's death had likely come as a result of her relative inexperience as a diver, another death that would occur just a few years later at the wreckage of the Yukon would come as the result of perhaps the exact opposite. At 4:30 p.m. on June 25, 2005, a 49-year-old diving instructor named Steve Donathan would descend to the wreckage of the Yukon alongside his advanced diving student and personal friend, a 46-year-old man named Joseph Dangelmeyer, as the pair planned to conduct training drills at depth for mask-off and air-off situations within the interior of the ship. Upon arriving at the Yukon, the two would conduct their planned drills for a little while, before Steve began to lead Joseph further into the ship's interior. As the duo were doing so, Joseph's guideline reel began to become tangled with his gear, and so he cut the reel loose and continued to follow Steve without it. After they made their way through the ship's interior for a short while, the duo had entered into one of the most secluded areas in the ship's interior, and Steve guided them towards a narrow hatch that had been formerly welded shut, which led to the interior of the Yukon's boiler room, which Steve had mentioned earlier that day had recently become accessible. Steve then proceeded to squeeze through the narrow opening. However, Joseph was unable to follow him, as he was physically larger than Steve and was unable to squeeze his body through the small hatch. However, Steve seemingly failed to notice that Joseph was no longer following him, and so Joseph was left waiting outside the hatch for Steve to return from within the boiler room. However, as the minutes passed by and the remaining time before they needed to begin their ascent to the surface grew increasingly tight, Joseph would attempt to capture Steve's attention by flashing his light inside the hatch. However, he would receive no response from Steve in return, and with no time left to continue waiting for him, Joseph ascended to the surface as planned, reasoning that Steve had likely exited not long after him and just hadn't seen his signals, and would report that he had become separated from Steve to the crew aboard their dive boat upon resurfacing. However, as the minutes passed, with no further sightings of Steve, concern would begin to mount, and officials were contacted regarding his disappearance at approximately 6 p.m. that evening. When interviewed about what had occurred during their dive together, Joseph was noticeably shaken and anxious, and as he was quite unfamiliar with the layout of the Yukon, he was unable to provide search and rescue officials with accurate information as to their exact whereabouts during their dive. However, civilian technical divers who were very familiar with the dive site had been assisting in the search and would provide officials with a list of areas within the ship for them to search further, which included the entrance to the boiler room, which was supposed to be off limits, but had been found with the hatch now opened. Upon inspecting the extremely narrow entrance to the boiler room, these volunteer divers would determine that it was too risky for them to enter, as to do so, they would be required to remove their tanks to fit through the opening, and furthermore, the boiler room was filled with a thick layer of silt as well. Officials would enter the boiler room following the volunteer diver's suggestion and subsequently located Steve's lifeless remains in a far corner wedged between two pipes near some cabinetry, although they noted that they didn't believe that he had become stuck between the pipes, but rather his body had simply ended up there by the time they managed to locate his remains. However, as officials attempted to remove his remains from the boiler room, they couldn't manage to make him fit through the opening, and so they would remove his gear and retrieve it later during a subsequent dive. Upon closer inspection of his equipment, his gas cylinders were found to have been completely emptied and with water inside them. It was determined that Steve had likely become extremely disoriented after kicking up the large amount of silt within the tight confines of the boiler room, and had failed to locate the exit hatch before he ran out of breathable air and drowned. Additionally, following his death, officials would state that the boiler room had never been opened for divers and was supposed to be off limits, and due to Steve's comments earlier in the day before his final dive that had contradicted this, it was theorized that it may have been Steve himself who had opened up the restricted hatch, as he was a dive instructor and frequent visitor to the wreckage who was intimately familiar with its interior. While the fault for the previous two deaths can be attributed to the deceased divers themselves, another diver fatality that would occur at the Yukon's wreckage in 2012 would occur largely because of factors outside of the victim's control. On December 1st, 2012, a 26-year-old woman named Stacy Jackson would embark on a chartered dive to the Yukon's wreckage. Stacy was an experienced recreational diver and was a Marine station nearby at Fort Pendleton, and would be undertaking the dive as part of a group of divers aboard the charter boat. Notably, however, the surf conditions that day were quite rough, with reported surf in the area ranging between 7 and 12 feet. Furthermore, as a result, the vessel that Stacy had chartered for her dive was one of only a handful of dive charter boats that would proceed to the site of the Yukon wreckage that day, as several other charter companies had canceled their operations that day as a result of the choppy waters. Upon arriving at the dive site that afternoon, Stacy and her group, consisting of 4 other divers, would begin to descend to the wreckage below. However, the conditions beneath the surface of the water were equally turbulent, as the divers were forced to contend with the strong, surging oceanic currents throughout their dive. The group entered the wreckage through one of the access holes, subsequently entering into the ship's interior to explore inside. While the group was exploring the interior of the ship, a surge of water from the churning currents rushed through one of the access holes and slammed Stacy into one of the ship's bulkheads, subsequently knocking her unconscious. Upon realizing that something had happened to Stacy, the group's dive master would grab a hold of her and proceeded to drag her from within the interior of the ship and towards the surface. Unfortunately, however, due to the strong churning currents, the dive master would begin to lose his grip, and Stacy slipped from his grasp and began to rapidly sink towards the seafloor below. After briefly deliberating on whether to descend after her, during which time he would likely reach depths that required decompression stops to safely ascend, the dive master would instead opt to return to the charter boat to report her disappearance. He would mention that Stacy had been contending with buoyancy issues throughout the course of their dive, and reasoned that these issues may have been why she sank so quickly after he had lost his grip on her, and her remains were located at approximately 5 p.m. that evening, although reports of where her remains were found vary wildly, with different local news outlets reporting that she had been found within a crevice on the exterior of the hull, with another outlet reporting that she had been located deceased tangled amongst lines that had been used during the dive, and retrieved and brought aboard the dive boat, and was then retrieved by officials the following day, with yet another simply stating that she had been located by officials adrift in open water. In wake of Stacy's unfortunate death, her family would launch a lawsuit against the dive charter company for negligence that led to Stacy's death. However, as is often the case with such lawsuits, the outcome of the lawsuit does not seem to be publicly available, and thus the sequence of events established as fact during this suit still remain unknown. Thank you all for watching.